A few months back, I put up a poll on my Instagram story for you all to help me decide what design to make with this gorgeous blue tartan fabric, and this is the design that you all helped me choose. So I have finally made it into an actual dress, and I'm going to show you how I went from this design sketch to this actual dress. Let's get into it. So to start off with, the pattern that I'm using for the bodice is a pattern that I'm currently developing. It's just a blouse pattern, but for this dress, I'm cutting it off at the waist and using it as a dress bodice. Hopefully this pattern will be launched in about 2 weeks, so get ready for that. But in the meantime, I started by cutting out the skirt, and the skirt is just long rectangular panels. I love cutting long rectangular panels on tartan because you have these perfectly on grain and on cross grain lines to follow, so you don't have to mark anything out. Then I went ahead and cut the front bodice pieces. I had kind of a mental block for cutting these, honestly, because I wanted to cut them on the bias so that the stripes would kind of be going diagonally and intersecting each other. But eventually I did cut it out, and then I laid one half cut out on top of the fabric to pattern match so that both sides of the bodice would match up. The rest of the bodice pieces were all cut on the straight grain. So I did a flat lining for the front and the back that was cut on the straight grain, and then the back was also just cut on the straight grain. The reason that I'm doing it this way is because the front is cut on the bias and the bias stretches a lot. So I wanted to have a straight grain piece to really anchor the fabric to, hence the flat lining and not bag lining, because with flat lining I will sew the darts together as one, which will give these two pieces of fabric a point where they're anchored together. I also created a pocket pattern based off of the size of my phone and cut out 4 of those from the same cotton lawn that I'm using for the lining. Then I went ahead and laid my flat lining and outer pieces together and basted them. Basting is a wonderful thing, y'all. Highly recommend it. After they were all basted together, I went ahead and sewed the 2 darts on the front and the 2 darts on the back. Then I went ahead and did some stay stitching around all of the edges of these pieces. This was just to help keep all of the layers together. I know I already basted them, but the outer fabric is not particularly structured, so I wanted to make sure that everything was going to stay in place. Then I went ahead and sewed the shoulder seams and the side seams with a French seam, so sewing it right sides out and then trimming the seam allowance down, flipping it around, and sewing it right sides in. Then I turned under and hemmed the armholes. I know this is like a lot of handwork, and there will be a method of sewing this blouse that has a lot less handwork that I show when I launch that pattern. The reason I'm doing this in such kind of a complicated and roundabout way is because of these really unstructured bias front pieces. So then I also did the neckline the same way, except I sewed it with a single fold hem by machine first before folding it again and sewing it by hand. So then moving on to the skirt, I pinned all of my pocket pieces onto the skirt panels, making sure they were the same distance from the top, and then I sewed them on right sides together. I pressed all of the seam allowances outwards towards the pocket pieces and then laid the front panels on top of the back panels, lined up the edges, and sewed down these side seams, pivoting and sewing around the pockets, and then continuing with the rest of the side seam. Then I took my long skirt panel and pleated it up. This took forever, and I didn't feel like doing math, so I just went off of the tartan and made sure that they were somewhat even on the right and the left, and it was the right length to fit into the bodice. And then I pinned the pleated skirt panels to the bodice and sewed them right sides together. Then I went ahead and did a narrow hem at the bottom of the skirt. To finish the front pieces, the skirt overhangs a little bit, so I could just do a double fold wide hem with that, but to finish the top section, I cut off the front of my pattern, so there actually wasn't enough fabric. This will definitely be fixed for the final pattern launch, but I decided to finish the front with a little facing, so I just cut out a thin strip of cotton lawn and sewed it right sides together to that front seam allowance edge, and then folded it around and back, folded the edges under, and hand stitched it down. I also hand stitched down the rest of the front of the skirt panels. To help close up the raw edge of the skirt attachment to the bodice, I did a big whip stitch around all of these edges, and you might be thinking, hey Aura, that looks ridiculous, messy, and not at all functional. It does look messy, I'll give you that. I found it to be surprisingly functional. This would, of course, be much more easily done with a zigzag stitch or with an overlocker, but I don't have access to either of those things right now, so I have found that it does surprisingly a lot. If you have, like, you know, a super prone to fraying fabric and like a 1/4 inch seam allowance, a whip stitch like this isn't gonna save you. But with a fabric that's at least a little bit less prone to fraying and more like 1/2 inch seam allowances, I found it to be surprisingly functional. So then I got these adorable little shell buttons and sewed them onto the front, and then cut out little buttonholes and stitched them by hand. My biggest tip for doing buttonholes by hand is to move the thread in a circle before doing your stitch, rather than putting your needle in and then moving the thread. I found it makes my buttonholes like 3 times faster. Then I basted the buttonholes shut and pressed them. I highly recommend doing this whether you're doing quick and messy hand-done buttonholes like I have, or more precise ones where you make sure all of your stitches are exactly the same size. This is something that I've copied from traditional men's tailoring. It is surprisingly really helpful, especially the basting part. And you might think, okay, do I really need to baste it? I could just press them closed. And you can, but the basting really helps to make sure that these buttonholes set in the proper position and not kind of hanging open, so I highly recommend trying this trick. Then I took out the basting stitches, and yeah, I think that was it. Oh, I also made a belt. So I just cut out a strip of fabric going all the way across from selvage to selvage and sewed it closed like a tube. I decided to make it a little bit narrower in the middle because I wanted it to be kind of closer to 1 inch in the middle, but then closer to 1.5 inches at the edges. Turned it and pressed it, having the seam in the middle so that when it is right side out, you don't get a seam on either edge. So I pressed it in half and then pushed the edges in and pressed it and hand stitched them closed to finish off the ends of this belt. And yeah, that was it. I hope you enjoyed this adorable summer dress. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!